Hey everyone. Tonight, let's dim the lights a little. Maybe shift the pillow. Let the day slide off your shoulders. Tonight, we're drifting back to ancient Rome. Not the loud, clangy Rome of movies. Not the shouting senators or the dramatic stabbing. Just the softer, dustier Rome. The one that exists at dusk. Where sandals scuff on stone. Where someone somewhere is very tired and deeply unimpressed with their job. Because while ancient Rome is often presented as a place of marble, power, and destiny, it was also a workplace. A massive, chaotic workplace. And like all workplaces, it had jobs that were unbearable, jobs that were fatal, and surprisingly, a few jobs that were actually kind of nice. So tonight, instead of focusing on emperors losing their minds or generals dramatically betraying each other, we're going to do something gentler. We're going to stroll through the Roman job market. Slowly, casually, with no ambition whatsoever. And we're only looking at the best jobs. The ones you might actually want. If you absolutely had to wake up in ancient Rome tomorrow morning and contribute to society. So let's settle in. And let's begin somewhere calm. In Rome, as in life, the best jobs were usually the ones that involved not doing very much. Or at least not doing very much physically. The Roman elite understood something timeless. The less your job involved lifting things, the better your life was likely to be. Which brings us gently to one of the most pleasant roles in the Roman world. The professional letter writer. Now, literacy in ancient Rome was uneven. Many people could read a little, fewer could write well, and even fewer could write in the smooth, polished Latin that made you sound educated instead of like someone who had learned their letters from a damp wall. So if you could write, really write, you were valuable. Letter writers, known as scribi or notarii, would sit in shaded areas near forums or markets. They had wax tablets, they had reed pens, and they had patience, which in Rome was already a rare skill. People would come to them with problems, family disputes, business arrangements, love letters that were mostly about olive groves, and the letter writer would translate those messy, emotional thoughts into something tidy and respectable. They didn't dig ditches. They didn't fight wars. They didn't get eaten by animals. They just wrote. And because of course this is Rome, many of them were slaves. But, and this isn't important, but they were the good kind of slaves. The kind who lived indoors, who wore clean tunics, who were sometimes freed later and became wealthy freelancers. Not bad. Not bad at all. Now let's drift, slowly, to another surprisingly tolerable Roman occupation. The bathhouse attendant. Roman bathhouses were everywhere. They were warm, they were steamy, they were social, and they were open to almost everyone. Rich, poor, free, enslaved. Everyone ended up soaking together eventually. And running these bathhouses required staff. Lots of staff. Some attendants cleaned floors, which admittedly is not glamorous. Others managed towels. Others monitored the temperature of the water. Some even gave massages. Yes, massages. In ancient Rome, if you were an attendant assigned to a wealthy bathhouse, your life could be downright cozy. You worked indoors. You were surrounded by warmth. You heard gossip all day, which is timelessly entertaining. And if you did your job well, you might receive tips. Actual money from people who were relaxed, half asleep, and feeling generous, which is the best kind of customer. Of course, there were worse bathhouse jobs. Someone had to clean the drains. We're not thinking about that person tonight. We're thinking about the towel guy, the calm one, the one who nods silently and hands you linen. Now, speaking of calm, let's wander into the world of teaching. Teachers in ancient Rome did not have an easy reputation. They were strict. They carried sticks. Corporal punishment was popular. But despite that, being a teacher, especially a tutor, could be one of the best gigs in the empire. Private tutors worked for wealthy families. They taught boys grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. Sometimes girls too, depending on the family. They lived in the household. They ate decent food. They stayed out of the sun. And if they were particularly good or particularly patient, they might become trusted advisors. Some tutors ended up deeply influential, whispering guidance into the ears of future senators and generals. Yes, they were often enslaved at first. Rome loved enslaving educated Greeks. But again, these were the premium slaves, the kind who eventually gained freedom and pensions. And really, if you must be owned by someone, being owned for your mind is far better than being owned for your back. Now let's drift toward something even quieter. The librarian. Yes, Rome had libraries, public ones, private ones, and they needed caretakers. Libraries were hushed spaces, full of scrolls, dusty but not dangerously dusty. And the people who worked there spent their days organizing texts, copying manuscripts, and occasionally explaining to someone that no, they could not take the scroll home. It was intellectual work, gentle work, and the kind of work that kept you away from politics, which was always a plus in Rome. No one stabbed librarians, generally. And speaking of avoiding stabbings, let's talk about accountants. Roman accountants, known as rationarii, were essential. The empire ran on taxes, taxes on land, taxes on trade, taxes on existing. Someone had to keep track of all of that. Accountants worked in offices. They handled numbers. They answered to powerful people, which was dangerous but also lucrative. A good accountant was trusted, and trust in Rome was basically currency. If you were honest and discreet, you could build a comfortable life. And if you were dishonest but subtle, well, Rome had a long tradition of looking the other way if the books mostly balanced. Now let's drift into something a little more unusual. The professional mourner. Yes, this was a job. At Roman funerals, especially elite ones, grief was a performance. And wealthy families wanted it done properly, loudly, dramatically, with wailing. So they hired mourners, people whose job was to cry, moan, and lament on cue. Sometimes they even wore masks resembling the deceased's ancestors, which is unsettling but effective. This job required emotional stamina, but not physical labor. And it paid well during peak death seasons, which in Rome were frequent. You cried, you got paid, you went home. Honestly, not the worst arrangement. Now let's slide gently into the realm of food, because food jobs can go either way. Being a cook in ancient Rome could be terrible, or excellent. There was very little middle ground. If you cooked for the poor, you were poor. But if you cooked for the elite, you were prized. Elite Roman cooks were celebrities. Some were paid enormous sums. Others were stolen, traded, or kidnapped between households. A talented cook could live comfortably. They worked indoors. They experimented with flavors. They had access to ingredients most people never saw. Of course, if dinner went badly, someone might shout at you or throw something, but that's just customer service. Now let's talk about something surprisingly peaceful. The gardener. Roman villas loved gardens. They were obsessed with them. Fountains, statues, carefully trimmed hedges, symbolic plants, entire philosophical concepts expressed through landscaping. Gardeners tended these spaces daily. They worked outdoors but in controlled environments. They weren't plowing fields. They weren't marching. They were pruning. It was repetitive, rhythmic, almost meditative. And if you were good, your employer might leave you alone entirely, which is the dream. Now, let's drift over to one final category, one that ties many of these jobs together. Administrative assistants. Rome ran on paperwork, decrees, edicts, records. Someone had to copy them, file them, deliver them. Messengers, clerks, record keepers, they moved through the empire quietly. They knew things, they saw things, but they rarely had to decide things. And in Rome, not deciding things was often the safest position of all. So as we slowly come to the end of this gentle tour of Roman employment, it's worth remembering something. Ancient Rome was harsh, violent, unequal. But even there, even in a world built on conquest and hierarchy, people found ways to carve out small pockets of comfort. A shaded bench, a warm bathhouse, a scroll-filled room, a kitchen that smelled like bread instead of blood. And if you were clever, lucky, and quiet, you might just have lived a life that was, if not happy, at least tolerable. So let's let the noise of the forum fade. Let the sandals stop echoing. And as we drift toward the next part, we'll stay right here in the soft glow of history's quieter corners. because tomorrow we'll talk about the jobs you absolutely did not want. But not tonight.